Doing all right? Yeah? All right, so we're going to take a look at WebSockets. We're going to end up doing it through an existing application that does not really have any WebSocket functionality. And we'll talk about some of the issues that you might end up running into. Let me share my screen. Yeah, I am actually. Okay, so I've got a little presentation that I'm going to pop up here that goes through some of the main takeaways when we're using Socket.io and React. So a couple of quick things here. First of all, when do we want to use Socket.io? Well, really, in the end, it's when we want to have some real-time functionality. So it's kind of important to note that you don't need Socket.io where a user ends up initiating some change, because if the user ends up making the change, then they have the ability, or the code at least has the ability, to know that that change was made because the user made it, and to update the UI. The key here is we want to use this when the user didn't make the change, right? Where you need to basically message the user from the server. So we're using a library here called Socket.io, and let's just talk a little bit about the different ends of this, meaning the server and the client. So from a server perspective, the socket server wraps around the node server. A request goes into node, says to node, I want to upgrade this to a socket, and then you have this two-way connection with a socket. Really, in its most important thing is that the socket has the ability to emit to other sockets. I could always make the case too that the socket could also listen for changes as well. From the client perspective, the client is going to connect the socket. The client really has to initiate this process. The client can also listen for messages. Now, the fact is that the client socket has the ability to emit to other sockets. The client has the ability to emit to the server, but for a lot of cases, they might not have to. And I think this is where people sometimes get a little bit lost with sockets. So my sort of first steps here are to get things working without sockets. So even if you just imagine you had to demo something and you said, well, here's browser A and here's browser B. Browser A ends up, making this change, and you go to browser B and you go over there and the change isn't made. Worst case scenario, you refresh the browser. Okay, obviously it's not a real-time application when you do that. But the fact is that if you end up getting things working without sockets, because a lot of the functionality is not going to involve sockets. If a user is making a change, that could be basically they're just making some request to the server, there's some post that they're doing, some put that they're doing, some delete that they're doing. That's going to end up remaining the same. So don't get your functionality set up so that it's not real time, that you have to refresh. Okay? Again, you never have to refresh if it's the user that made the change, because the user knows they made the change. This is really when we're talking about other users. We want the server to notify the clients. So there's a reason why this gets to be a little bit tricky for a couple of different things. One of them being is that as your application ends up getting bigger, you've got your socket stored in one part of your application. From our client perspective, we've got our socket on our client, we've got our Redux store, and we've got to find a way of connecting these. From the server perspective, it's kind of similar if you think about it. We're going to probably end up making changes to our models. This is probably 95% of the time you're going to have some persistent data on your server. There's going to be a change to the model. Again, the user that made the change, you don't have to deal with them. It's the other users. So how do we connect our socket server to the models? And that's what we're going to end up taking a look at. So I sent out a starting repo If I end up logging into this repo, I could log in to Cody at email.com. Okay. If I end up going over to messages, the way that this model is set up, and we can take a look at it, is that we have messages, a user, a message belongs to a user. A user can have many messages. So if I'm Cody and I go over here, I put in hello, and I hit return, I end up seeing that. This is not being done through sockets. If I was to go over here and log in as another user, first of all, the way that this is set up is this will end up throwing an error if the user is not logged in, but let me log in. I always forget who this other user is. Let's actually, Murphy, that's right, very good. Murphy and Cody, I think, are both dogs. So Murphy at email.com. 123 is the default password here. So I'm logged in as Murphy. It's me, Murphy. Okay, Murphy sees the message, but Cody doesn't see the message. This is where the sockets come in, but like I said before, we do have our functionality working. Unfortunately, it's not really working in real time. So let's take a quick look at our code. And let's close a few of these down. Okay. So there's a couple of key points here. One of them being that one of the things that I want to do is let's first focus on the server. So it kind of makes sense that one of the things that I want to do on the server is that if I look at my message model, what I want to do is, hey, look, a new message ends up coming across. Now, this is very, very simplistic. We don't have any security that's going on here. We're just going to say, hey, look, if you end up creating a message, if a message gets created, I should say, we're going to end up letting you know about it. And we're going to end up letting you know about it. A very easy way to do this is to keep this close to the database by putting in a second object here that are hooks. And if I was to go over here, I'm going to put a hook here for after create. This is going to be a function that's going to be my message. And I'm going to console log this message just so I could end up seeing it. So if I end up going in and looking at my console, let me move this up to the other screen. And I go over here and I create a new message. I'll see that that message shows up on the server. Okay? The key is that I want to send this out to my other sockets. And this is where this diagram comes in that makes this a little bit tricky to do. Because I've got my socket server on the server and I want to access it from my models. Now, the way that this is set up, and this is not all that uncommon, is that I really want to do something along the lines of, you know, some socket server, I want to emit the message, whatever this message is. Okay? One thing you'll also end up noticing with this message, if I go and take a look at it, I'll see the message has the user ID, but it doesn't have the actual user. So one thing that I might want to do is also get the user as well. And the way that I'm going to end up doing that, I'm going to comment this out for a minute. But I want to actually get that complete message with the user. So what I'm going to do, one of the things that you could end up doing here is that, and you might not know this, but this comes up too, is I could say, hey, message, I want to end up reloading you. This happens when you want to end up loading some dependencies here. And I'm going to say, I want you to include, and I want you to include the user. Now, this is also something that comes up. How do you access models from other models? And since a message belongs to a user, I've got my DB object here, has a models property, and this is basically how I reference it. This way, I don't have to have dependencies of including one model from another model and running into a circular dependency issue. This should be the same. But now, when I console log the message, I should also end up seeing the user as well. You could do this with async await as well. Either one will end up working. And so now, if I go back to my UI, let's just see. This is just taking a while to load. Okay, so if I go back to my UI and I go back over here, I'll see not only do I end up having my data, but I have my user as well because my front end's going to use it. So this is something you could end up doing if you wanted to load this outside of sockets, but if you wanted to load some additional information. Now, the problem that I'm going to run into here is that if I go and I look on the server at how my sockets are set up, I'll see the only method that I have here is this actually ends up getting passed, and this is in fact my socket server. Okay? This is my socket server. This is actually what's being set up for my socket server. The fact is, this is actually what I want. Okay? There's a little bit of a problem here, though. And the problem that I'm going to end up running into is that this code ends up setting up my socket server. And if I go down here and I look at where this is set up, this actually requires socket and passes in the socket server. So the problem is that my server is really at the top of my application. My server depends on a lot of other things. I can't have those things depend on the server. So I'm going to do something a little bit different here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this, and I'm going to change it so that this is not just one method, but I'm going to call a method called setup. If I went to run this now, this thing is going to blow up, right? It'll tell me that setup is not a function, but I could get this to work just by going over here to socket, and I'm going to change this. This is going to be setup. And I'll say module exports equals an object called setup. Okay? So now this will work the same way. Nothing really changes. This way my app will end up compiling. Why am I doing this? Well, what I really want to do is I want to use this module to actually store this I/O object. And what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to put in let underscore IO. And I'm going to say when you call this, IO equals IO. So it's the server's responsibility to set this up. When the server ends up setting this up, I'm going to store this. Now, this wouldn't make a lot of sense if I didn't do anything with it. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to have a method called getIO. And this method is just going to end up returning this IO object. This is my socket server. Okay? So what this is now going to allow me to do is if I end up going back to my model, and I sometimes forget what level this is on, I'm going to have to go up 2 levels here to socket. And what I could do is I could say, well, socket equals require dot dot slash socket. Let's make sure that that doesn't end up breaking anything. And what I'm going to end up doing here is after I end up getting this message, I'm going to use my socket by saying socket get IO, which is actually your socket server. That's my socket server that my server had set up, and I'm going to emit message with this message. Okay? Let's test that out. Let's see if this breaks anything or if it ends up working. So I'm going to go over here, and I'll go over here, put in testing. Okay? I end up getting this back. It doesn't look like I've got any errors on the server. So let's see now if our message is being sent out. Okay? Let's see now how we deal with it on the client. So definitely a little bit of rearranging that we have to do here, but not a ton. Okay? We took a method, we ended up modifying it. Most of the code is the same here. Inside of our socket, we're just saying, hey, look, server, you set up the socket server. That's great. We want to have access to it later on. Now, if we end up going back to the client, question is, where do we end up putting this on the client? Well, first things first here, let's go and take a look at where we could end up setting this up. So one thing we could do here is we've got our routes. And one of the things maybe we could do is that we've got our routes for our server, and let's take a quick look. We've got our app, we've got our routes. So one of the things that happens in our component did mount, we actually can take our socket server and say, hey, look, we want to know if a new message ends up coming in. So on the client side, we also have a socket. This is a little bit easier to use. On the client side, if we take a look, there's a socket right at the same level, which is in fact our socket. So what we can do here, we could go back to our routes, and I'm just going to go over here, and I'm going to say import socket from /socket. And I'm going to go over here and I'll say, hey, look, socket, do me a favor. Okay? This is now the client on message. Let me see what the message is. So I'm going to end up going back over here. Let's open up my dev tools. Let me refresh this page. Okay, so I'm going to type in hello here, and I'll see that I actually get this back. Now, I don't need it. Okay, I really don't need it. But if I go over and I take a look at Murphy, Murphy doesn't need the message he sent. Okay, but I'm going to get it over here. Okay, so we're sort of tying things up. We're setting up, we have to have the socket emit something on the server. Okay, we've got the client that ends up now getting the message. So how do we tie it together to our Redux store? Well, what's interesting about this, we could do all kinds of things. We could say, hey, look, new message, go and fetch all the messages. But we don't really have to do that. And since it's not the message that we created, we've got the message already. There's nothing that's asynchronous about this, right? We already have the message. In fact, if I go over and I take a look at my Redux store, so on our client, if I look at the Redux store, I'll see that there is actually a create message, which is for me when I create the message, but I've got this action creator where given a message, it'll end up adding it to the store. Now, right now it's not exported. I like to sometimes do this syntax. The thunk is create message. The action creator is with an underscore. I think a little bit less when I end up setting it up this way. But what I could do here is I could export this. I could end up exporting create message. And what this allows me to do, because don't forget, if a socket tells me there's a new message, all I have to do is add it to my Redux store. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to really, this is the main entry point of my application. And since I end up exporting this, I'm going to import create message. Okay? Now, the question is, how do you end up interacting with your Redux store? Well, the easiest way to interact with your Redux store, we're doing it already, is through the dispatch method. Okay? And what I could do here is I could say, hey, look, here's another dispatch method. I could name it create message. Nothing prevents me from doing this. This syntax always throws me a little bit off here. I sort of prefer this. I know the other one is shorthand. But what do I want to do when create message ends up getting called? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this message, and what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to dispatch. Okay, I've got the message already. So here's my action creator. Create message, message. Okay? So what I've done is I've made it a little bit easier for my component. My component doesn't have to actually go out and get the store and dispatch anything. I'm using my simple action creator. Okay? So if someone else ends up entering a message, I could go back over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call. How do I access something that's passed in? Same way I did it on line 14. This props create message. Okay? Maybe the naming isn't great, but still, this should work. And let's refresh over here. And let's refresh over here. And what should happen, I end up adding Cody over here. Cody gets added. For some reason, I think something was a little bit off here. Okay? I'm seeing something kind of interesting here. Okay? I'm seeing that for my message, it ended up getting added twice. If I go over here, and I hit enter, again, for me it got added twice, but over on Murphy, it's okay. Okay? Pretty easy thing to straighten out. Okay? Reducers only get run one at a time, and it's pretty easy for me to say, to keep things relatively simple, to go over here and say, hey, look, let me go back to messages. And before, because, you know, it's interesting what the error message is. The error message says, hey, look, you got two messages with the same ID. You know how you get that warning when you don't put in an ID? Now I've got two IDs that are the same because I've got the same message. I have the one because I added it and I knew to update my Redux store, but the server said, hey, I don't care who added it, I'm sending it down to everybody. So what I need to do here is that in my store, I'm just going to do something real simple. I'm just going to say, hey, look, if within my state I can find a message where the ID of the message is equal to the action message ID, then I already have it. Okay? I already have the message. I don't want to add it to my state twice. So I could just end up returning the state. Okay? Again, I had it working for myself, but then I broke it for myself because when a message comes in, I get it twice. Now, I am Cody. I think it's not running the. Let's just double check this. Okay, so now I only get the message once, and Murphy gets it. Send this here. The problem that I have is I didn't refresh this page. Now I could see Cody again, see the message here. Murph again, see the message here, and it ends up working. Okay? So these things can be a little bit tricky to end up setting up. Now, notice a couple of things here. And this does get to be a little bit tricky, and this is kind of a next step. Right now, as far as I'm concerned, all sockets are equal. Okay? Whoever is connected up, I'm going to send them this message. You might ask the question, how can I determine what user a socket is connected to? And there are ways to do it, although it's a little bit tricky to do. It's real tricky to do when we're using session cookies. Because really the way that we have to end up doing it is that, and you could look this up in the Socket.io documentation. If we look up Socket.io, and we end up looking up under the documentation, let's take a look. Using with Express. And let's take a look, even if it's here. Oh, I think it might be, so in order to end up doing this, you actually have to add some more, do a little bit more work, and I'm not even sure this is the documentation that I'm looking at here. There is something here with Express, but literally you have to, the same way that you're using Express middleware to identify the user, you have to do the same thing with Socket.io. And what's unfortunate about that is that it gets to be a little bit tricky to do. It works when the app first loads because it's making a connection with the socket, and you could end up identifying the user, in which case you could say, hey, look, this socket is for this user. And if you want to send a message to a specific user, you could go and look for the socket that has that user ID, and you could end up doing it. What I would say is for now, I wouldn't worry about it too much. You could always put a big to-do there. Here for your applications, you're getting them to run. But even in your app now, if you did need to go and identify the user, I mean, one thing you could do is you could send a message, and you could listen for that message, and you could say, hey, look, if that message has to do with me, I'll end up dealing with it. If it doesn't have to do with me, I'll ignore it. Now, that's not really a good long-term system. What gets to be a lot easier when you're using sockets is if you have authentication tokens. Because what you could end up doing is a user logs in, they end up getting a token. You could end up making a socket request with that token. And you could basically say, hey, look, I'm going to take that token. I'll find out who the user is. And I can match up and then basically say, this socket belongs to this user. Not the easiest thing to do when you're using cookie authentication. There's a few more hoops that you have to jump through in order to do that. This is, I think, one case where sometimes, it's worth moving things around, and instead of doing cookie authentication, maybe using JWT tokens, I think things will be a little bit smoother if you end up doing that. But in order to get this to work, we could actually take a quick look here. If we were to just look, at the code we needed to do to make this real time, it's not really a ton of code, right? We added the one hook in order to do this. I will show you one minor issue here that we should probably end up fixing. I actually have a seed function. If I run that seed function, the seed function runs outside of the context of a server. That's just the way that it's set up. So one of the things you could do on the seed function is you could just ask the question. You could just be a little bit defensive. And you could say, hey, look, do me a favor. Message. I only want to do this if, in fact, this is set up. And this is not going to be set up when you're seeding your data. Seeding your data connects to the database, and then kills the connection. There's no express server that it's doing, no express server, no socket server. So if it can't end up getting the socket server, and now I'll have a new file here, and I could actually even test that out by going over here, and I'll have a new set of messages, which is just one message. So we could look at sockets in a bit more detail, but again, if I wouldn't focus on it right at the beginning. I would get things working and say, okay, now I need this to work real time. How am I going to end up going about doing it? Because you'll notice that there was no, when I ended up creating my message, I didn't have to emit anything through the sockets. I just go to the server. Server says, oh, change ended up getting made. I'm going to end up broadcasting it out to everybody else. Anyway, any questions about this? What do you think? Pretty usable? Okay, very, very important. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Well, you got a little bit of a problem there. The problem is you could do it, but the problem that you have there is that what you're really doing is you're subscribing to something, and I really want to have it in my component. So there's really not another place to put it. It's a good question. The problem that you end up running into, and this is the question of how do I connect this to my Redux store? And the fact is that, look, you're going to listen for that change. When that change ends up coming in, you decide what you want to do. It's totally within your control. I mean, heck, you could say, hey, look, something comes in from a socket. I'm going to use the history object and take the user to a new page. You could do that, It's whatever you want to do. But once you say, hey, look, I'm going to rely on this Redux store, and we are relying on the Redux store, relying on it to show the number of messages that are on the top. If we're on that page, we're using it to look at the messages. So the fact is, how do we have access through our Redux store? Well, we have access to it through a connected component. This was a little bit easier because this component never unmounts. If it unmounted, I think I would probably want to unsubscribe and resubscribe or something along those lines. But the fact is that it's perfectly fine, at the top level, of your application. But again, I think, look, a big part of this is just looking at the separate parts of the application. When you see that you need something, it would be very common to say, well, what the heck is the connection between these two things? And probably the trickiest part is to realize, hey, look, on the server, you need to get that socket server. How do you end up doing it? It's perfectly legitimate to just park it somewhere in another file, and when you need it, you end up accessing it. Outside of doing that, you'd never want, since it's being set up in the server, you don't want to have the server dependent upon other modules and have those other modules dependent upon the server. You get into a circular dependency, and it can lead to some things that, I guess, if you know enough about circular dependencies, you'll be able to expect them. But to me, I think they're unexpected things that you just don't see. Any other questions anyone has? Okay. So look, we've got a big weekend coming up. Let me actually stop this recording.